Yeah, let's take a look at the schedule. We're on April 4th. So actually from last week on, we are into 2 weeks before. We're into the third part of this class, which concerns the cloud and precipitation data sets and how to use them to analyze some cloud and precipitation problems. So it's application. It's no longer a lecture type, a purely lecture type class. So the format is a bit different from the first two parts of the class. When we were in satellite orbits, when we were studying radiation, remote sensing, were both based mostly on lectures. But from 2 weeks before, we're into the part more into the application. So the class will be kind of like a lecture, lab, mixture of both. And the contents are more for you to think. So I'm going to throw some questions for you to think how you can answer these questions using satellite data. So that's kind of the format of the class for the rest of the semester. I'm going to discuss the final project just toward the end of today's lecture. That's something you need to start planning now, because according to the schedule, right? So you are going to have a final project presentation toward the end of the class, and I allow each group to have 2 people. If you want to team up with someone else, just try to find your partner. If you want to work alone, that's okay, by yourself, a single project. So I'm going to come back to this topic toward the end of the class today. Okay, so for now, any questions before the class? From online? Okay. I'm just going to briefly review the data set you have played with. The past 2 weeks, I introduced 3 data sets to you. Right? So one is the ISCCP, International Satellite Cloud Climatology Project, introduced to you, I think, a monthly mean data set. It's kind of a high-level summary of cloud distribution of different cloud types. I also introduced to you the GPCP. It's also similar to ISCCP. It's a higher level monthly average summary of the climatology. And TRIM data is more detailed. I give you a code, a sample data that is more like instantaneous 3-hourly data sets that you can look at more detailed features of precipitation. So these are 3 data sets we have discussed, I have introduced to you through the labs. And then in next lab, I'm going to introduce the other data set to you so that you have a complete set of what I have been described earlier lecture regarding this data sets. And for homework number 2, I think you should start working on it now. It's not very difficult, actually, given that you have the code from me already. It's just go through the steps. One student already turned it in, so don't wait until Wednesday. It's due this Wednesday, by the way. So just work on it earlier. Those data set, those homework questions will help you kind of get a feel of this data set and see what kind of questions you can answer. Because those homework questions, especially the last 2 questions, ask you to think a little bit about what you can learn from the data set. It's a small question, not very difficult. Most of you will know the answer right away. But those are good examples for building upon your final project. Perhaps from those homework questions, you get some inspiration. Instead of looking at the problem I asked you to look at for the homework, you could look at some other problems you encountered in your own research or out of your own interest based on this data set I introduced. Right? So that's the idea of the homework. It's not meant to trick you. It's just an exercise. Okay, so we're going to continue today. I'm going to give you some examples of how to make sense of this data set, to look at how cloud and precipitation can be used to infer what's going on in the atmosphere, right? So in earlier class, I introduced these different cloud types. So clouds are classified by their height and by their optical thickness. So in the traditional view, it's based on the height and appearance. Well, the appearance is basically the optical thickness. If it looks brighter, thicker, it's just the optical thickness higher. And then the height of the clouds is basically the cloud top placement. So according to these two dimensions, we divide clouds into nine types. It's kind of arbitrary, but we have to find some scheme to chop them to match the traditional view of clouds. That's based on visual check. Right? So deep convection, for example, are those that are really deep, thick, optically thick, and their top is very high. Cirrus are those that are tall, but optically very thin. So other cloud types, you will find your corresponding height and optical thickness. A few things I want to mention about the fundamentals of clouds. You know, clouds, there are many purposes for clouds. Clouds can modify the climate by reflecting sunlight, by trapping long-wave radiation, by producing rainfall. Those are the functions. Those are what they do to the climate system. But on the other hand, clouds is also kind of a tracer. It traces what's happening in the atmosphere. You know, atmosphere, you know, the blue sky is so blue that you don't see anything at all. You thought it's empty. That's because there's no tracer to trace all the movements. But cloud, it's kind of a tracer that can tell you what's happening in the atmosphere, right? Because to form clouds, you have to condense air. Vapor has to condense, has to go from, water vapor has to go from gaseous phase to liquid and solid phase. You have to condense them. So condense them, the most effective way is to cool them. And the most effective way to cool the air parcel atmosphere is to for the air parcel to rise. You could cool them by putting them in a cold surface. That happens during some situation, but in most 99% of the situation that the cloud formed because there is a rising motion. So in that sense, cloud can be taken as a tracer to trace air motion. If air rises, it forms clouds. If air sinks, it warms the atmosphere, it warms the air, and it evaporates clouds and dissipate clouds, right? So that when you see clouds, you can safely infer there's rising motion in the atmosphere at that layer. If it's a deep rising layer, it's a deep clouds, shallow cloud layer, shallow rising motion. So that's kind of the first statement I want to put in here for you to infer, use clouds to infer what's happening in the atmosphere. And yeah.
So it's not really related to this class, but I'm still curious if you know. Do you know if we have the capacity to observe clouds on other planets and whether we can compare them to Mars?
Absolutely, that's a very good question. So people study planetary science. They do observe, they do study that you can observe clouds in other planets. For example, on Venus, it's sulfuric acid. Sulfuric acid make clouds and they reflect sunlight. You can observe them. They're not necessarily made of water, but they're made of other things. And the nature of those clouds, well, if it's sulfuric acid, then the way to interpret them strictly as rising and sinking motion, you have to think. That's not my expertise. You have to find the principle there. But these two statements here apply to clouds on Earth because they're mostly made of water. Water, in order for them to condense, needs to cool. To cool, the most effective way is to rise. So in that sense, yeah, this may not apply to other planets, but there are principles, other planets, you can use clouds to infer motion. That's a very good question. Some other clouds that, well, some other planets, clouds may not be made of, there are dust storms on certain planets that it's a different story to infer the air motion. But that's a good question to think about. Yeah. So don't treat these statements as applicable everywhere in all the planets. It's just for the Earth. For vapor, we have water as the H2O as the main ingredient of clouds. Any other thoughts, questions? Okay, so we're good. So under these principles, let's take a look at some of the data set we have looked at. This is supposed to be a homework, right? So you are going to turn in this homework in 2 days. You don't have to plot them all in one single figure, but you can plot them in 9 figures or in parts. That's fine. It's up to you. Once you're more savvy in programming, you can better handle the subplots. The way I plotted it is basically similar to this diagram here. Deep convection is in the upper right corner, cirrus in the upper left, right? Lower clouds are in the lowest row. So I'm just putting them here this way. So, and then I'm using a common color scale, which may not be the best way, because some clouds look, smaller occurrences not that very obvious to your eyes. But anyway, this is one way to plot it. So we're going to take a look at some of the subplots and try to infer from this satellite data what's happening in the Earth's atmosphere. So the first question I want you to think is, I'm putting out one specific type here, which is deep convection, right? So based on the distribution of deep convection here, I want you to think or do a think, pair, share question. So you think about the question, you pair up with a neighbor and share your answer. Where do you think the rising motion atmosphere is located? Where do you think the sinking motion is located? Do you see any general pattern? Can you generalize this to say something about the circulation of the atmosphere just based on deep convection? Because deep convection is so deep, it's kind of representative of the motion of the whole column of the troposphere. So other cloud types may tell you more of a regional limited layer. So deep convection, we start from that.
So is that plot supposed to represent where the convection is?
Okay, so that figure is basically this figure. I plotted separately. It represents the occurrence frequency of deep convection. So whenever you see the number, for example, here, maximum is about, I would say 10, that means 10%. So of all the pixels you satellite viewed for the 10 years, then 10% of them are deep convective clouds. Yeah, and this white color are close to 0, maybe 0.1%. So that means out of the 10 years satellite have been viewing that place for millions of times, millions of pixels. If you survey them, you got the occurrence frequency of close to 0. So that's what the information is about. Okay, so I'll give you a few minutes to think. Just treat this as if it's a test question, or I want you to write an essay based on the information and what you learn in the class. You can discuss with your neighbors. Maybe you can see better if I turn in the lights. Right. So let's hear what each groups think. Anyone wants to volunteer to share your thoughts, the consensus from your group? What do you infer from this? It's kind of an open question, right? So you, if this is the first time you see this, you might, yeah, based on the evidence you are presented, what can you infer? Yeah, Frida? You see something along the equator? Okay, good. So,
I don't know, there's a matrix of cells that are rising near the equator and then they're dropping the air at midnight.
you mean here, right?
Yeah, those spaces.
Okay, so you see the contrast of the large occurrences here and nearby north and south, right?
Yeah, and also see that something's happening over land or more clouds over land, so that's related to the temperature.
Okay, so you're making 2 points already. Your first point is that you see a narrow band concentration of deep convection near the equator, and then there's a minimum immediately north and south of it. So you're saying there's a rising and sinking motion, right? It's a cell, and you also mentioned some land-ocean contrast. How do you what's where is?
So we see that some clouds are located over the traditional deep ocean current regions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so like North America, Europe, and
Okay.
North America.
Okay.
So
Okay, nice. So you cover actually from both tropics to mid-latitude. Yeah, that's very good. It's a good start. Any other groups want to add to this?
Yeah, I think so. She's describing as a Hadley cell.
Hadley cell. The more technical term now. So yes, if you have taken the climate change class or some other atmospheric science class, you know, tropics, there's a cell called Hadley cell. Hadley cell, air rises near the equator and sinks in the subtropics, north and south. So that explains this narrow band here and sinking motion outside, right? So that's very good. Just from the distribution of clouds, you can already infer something that the circulation is in the tropics, low latitude, such that it rises in the
It's
tropics.
also important to note that we could visualize the Hadley cell on multi-year read. That's not something that you can see instantaneously, right?
It's a very good point. So that means you had some experience. If you take an instantaneous satellite picture, you do not see as clearly a band like this. You see here and there storms, and tomorrow they move east-west. And if you take long-term mean, you will see this band in here. But if you take instantaneous mean, you may not see it. That's something you can investigate. I told you the answer, but exactly what's the nature, to what extent that is the case, you can investigate to see, because I'm going to introduce to you on Wednesday's lab, some of the instantaneous data set, no longer monthly mean, instantaneous data set, you can investigate, yeah, how deep convection are clustered or along the band. Very good point. Other thoughts? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so there's two things to that. One was the convection of the lands, either happens here, a lot of moisture, like Central Africa, over the Amazon. But then if you look at the layers, it looks like that's topography. And then like
North.
yeah, that was interesting.
Okay.
It's like a formation of mountains. I guess the same thing for Antarctica. I would expect there to be like a spike down there.
Yeah. So that's a very good point. So there are some details in addition to the most obvious stuff, thin line. I guess that's what keep most people's attention first. There are some details. Gabe mentioned specifically, there are some clusters over Africa. There are clusters over Amazon. There are some in South China, north of India. And then there are even some in Antarctica. So yeah, very good. So those are other patterns. I guess the one in Africa and Amazon, you can combine them as this tropical rising motion, right, along the equator. It's not as sharp as this line, but they're still centered near the equator. Air rises. And especially taking Africa as an example. Oh, the other group, well, yeah. Taking Africa as an example, you see if air rises here, it sinks on both sides. You do indeed see on both north and south, you see minimum in deep convection. So that's kind of consistent with the Hadley cell rising near the equator and sinks in the subtropics, a branch, right? So that's, actually, I should show this already. There's no need to hide it. It's kind of, if you want to draw a simple cartoon, you can, we know that this is a model of the general circulation of atmosphere, which applies to the most general feature. There are some local circulation, but in terms of general pattern, this is the case. It rises in the equator and sinks near the subtropics. That's the Hadley cell, and you can see Hadley cell everywhere, in here, or in here, or even to some extent in here. It rises here, then sinks on both ends, north and south. So if you imagine you average this feature along the longitude and condense them to only a latitude and height feature, they will show the cells like what's been drawn in cartooning here. That's what we meant by general circulation, general feature, not specific to any location, but it's generally applying. It's just yeah. You can visualize that even on these global maps of clouds. Then coming to your question about other places, your point, north of India. Well, the nature of this, my first guess would be has to do with monsoon, but we have to investigate and see which month it achieved this maximum, right? This is the 10-year average. So if this shows up predominantly during the summer monsoon season, then you can attribute this to monsoon. If some of them are from winter season, So there might be other sources. As to the one in Antarctica, I have a lot of doubt about there actually being deep convection, because we know that elevation there is very high, a few kilometers elevation. So it can push clouds easily to 440 hectopascal, even if they're not convection by nature. So that needs further investigation. But it falls into deep convection just because the retrieved optical thickness is very high, higher than 23, and its cloud height is higher than 440 hectopascal. So it falls into that category. But exact nature really being convected from surface, that needs to be investigated.
So how about that for now? So,
Where?
like on your back.
For aerosol?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so for aerosol is another cell in the mid latitude. Yeah, I forgot to discuss. I focus on Hadley cell. Then you might notice that there's if you do the zonal average, you might see there's another band of maximum in deep convective clouds along here, the storm tracks, right? So this has to do with the circulation in mid latitude. For aerosol, it rises in the higher mid latitude and higher, like 40, 50, 60-ish north-south, and sinks in the subtropics. So you can think of a 3-cell circulation being manifested here, rising here, sinking here, rising here, sinking here, right? So the 3-cell, at least not the polar cell, but the 2-cell, 1 cell in the tropics, 1 cell in the mid-latitude, can fit in with the distribution of deep convective clouds. So whenever you see a maximum here and here, they are the rising motion, then sinking motion in the subtropics in between here. Yeah, so that's the general feature you can infer.
And so that rising motion along the mid-latitudes can be explained with thermal lattice contrast?
Well, that's more complicated. So tropical cell, the rising motion is very easy to explain. It's what we call thermally direct. It's because it's hot and boils, right? But the mid-latitude, it's driven by the temperature contrast, north-south, and what they call baroclinic instability. So it's more indirect. It's driven by, there's a large contrast in temperature from the polar side and the equator side. So that clash of temperature, the gradient, brews the storms in the mid-latitude. So they are not what we call the thermally direct, they are thermally indirect. If you just think about the bottom, it may not be so hot, but that clashing of temperature brews storms in the mid-latitude, generates this storm track in the mid-latitude. So that's more complicated. But regardless, you can tell from here where rising motions in the atmosphere are concentrated. Regardless of the source of that rising motion, it's because of thermal, because of other clashing of temperature. They generate rising motion to make deep convective clouds. Yeah. Maybe.
Is it because the jet stream that the maximum was over the ocean and not over land?
So if you want to ask exactly why it's located in here but not much in here, it has to do with the land-ocean contrast to some extent. They generate wavy structure that favors the trough over the ocean. So there are some long-standing waves that produce the trough over ocean, less over land. So that does play a role. But in a daily instantaneous sense, you know, this storm will parade in the mid-latitude anywhere, just like the Hadley cell. You don't see this feature on the instantaneous map. Sometimes the storm is even over land, more over land, but just the long-term average, it puts more emphasis in here. It have larger occurrences over ocean. So that is a subject beyond this class. I cannot even give a few simple words to explain. It does have to do with the land-ocean contrast and generation of the waves. That waves are stationary waves that will show up in the long-term mean. Yeah. So a lot of detailed, rich features you want to analyze from the distribution of clouds. in this class, we're just scratching the surface. My original intention is just to investigate where the rising motion is located. So you guys are digging deeper. That's very good. So curious, and so you could perhaps build your final project upon this, find a way to go beyond just the rising motion, to look at the source of the rising motion, what's behind it. Right. So that's very good. Okay, so that's a good discussion. This is just the beginning. I have a number of slides for you to think about. Any questions and thoughts on this first one, deep convection? Very good. So we can tell a good story just from the distribution of deep convective clouds. But remember, we have 9 cloud types, right? Each cloud type you can pull out and find a story to tell. Now, the second story I want you to discuss is another cloud type, which is the stratocumulus clouds. So here's the global pattern. You can see that they are very, very different from the distribution of deep convective clouds. You see maximum over eastern part of the ocean in the subtropics, right here as well, to some extent here, and here as well. Oh, this one is the same as this one, connects. Okay, so I also included some satellite pictures. If you take, this is off the coast of California, so you can see that there's California, Mexico, Arizona. You can see this layer of clouds, very bright, but they're very low. Their top is no higher than 680 hectopascal. And then this is another picture from International Space Station. This is from MODIS, I believe. Okay, so now new questions for you. How do you explain the prevalence of these low clouds in this location? How do you make sense of it? Okay, so you can find your old group and think about it. There are questions online here. Along the equator, 60. Oops, I guess I missed your. So guys online, yeah, very good. You were contributing. I will make sure I call you for this round of the question. Right? I guess this is more difficult than the previous one, but try to think, yeah.
Professor,
Yeah.
what's the
Go ahead.
location on the picture on the right?
The location, the first picture is California. The other one, let me, you know what? I would tend to think it's also off the coast of California. That, you mean the rightmost photo?
Yeah, the rightmost photo.
That's my guess. But it has to be one of those maximums in the global map. If you look at the leftmost global map, you see a few both eyes here. must be from one of those. I would guess it's for this guy. Okay, so yep, let's hear some of your thoughts. What about the origin of these clouds? How do they form and why do they not grow all the way to as deep convective clouds, but are kept as low clouds?
I think what we said last discussion still applies, right? Those clouds are mostly located in latitudes that are 30 degrees north approximately and 3 degrees south.
Okay, so let's go back to the previous slide. Previous slide, whoops, is deep convective clouds. So if you put these two together, let me go all further back so you can have a context, have a comparison. The one we analyzed first was this one, deep convection, right? Now we're looking at this guy, stratocumulus clouds. So their relation to deep convection, basically the fill of the hosts where deep convection is. So you see here, this maximum will fill here. And this maximum will fill here. Yeah, so they occur where deep convection does not occur.
Right, so then that tells me that in a multi-year average, there's steam air motion in those regions. Maybe that's preventing the clouds from.
Okay, very good. So you made a connection to the Hadley circulation already, right? So there's a sinking motion that which prevents them from shooting all the way up, right? So they're kept. Very good. So that's already found one piece of the ingredient for these clouds. There are sinking motion, and that caps them from growing, developing. What other ingredients could be there? Yeah.
I'm not sure if this is a direct cause, but there's a correlation between the hotspots and where there's cold ocean circulation.
Very good. That's another good observation. So cold ocean circulation. So you took that from other classes, right? That's it's a cold ocean current from north to south, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The
South America, it's the mirror image along the equator. Yep. Okay, so how do you want to explain the formation of clouds there?
possibly because it's a cold ocean situation there, there's really no warm ocean water to give energy to the deep convection.
Okay, so that's very good. Unlike the equator where ocean water is very warm, you brew convection from below, like you boil water. But here, you cannot boil them to very high. It's very cold. Okay, that's good. And cold water actually contribute to some of the formation of the clouds because they chill them to condense. It's kind of in the Goldilocks zone. It's not too cold. It's not as cold as Arctic. Arctic is too cold. Sometimes there's no vapor in the atmosphere to condense to begin with. There are some vapor, enough vapor there, but it's relatively chill because of the cold current. They will make air to condense, but that condensed air, it's not vented very well. If it's in the tropics, if you condense, go deep convection, they vent through the whole troposphere. But here, they're all kept by that sinking motion. Sinking branch of the Hadley circulation that prevent them from developing very tall. So there are some cartoons drawn to describe this. Before I show that, I want to answer questions from online. There are students asking, does it have to do with the low aerosol? That's a very interesting thought. So we're talking about aerosol. Aerosol play a role, but if you attribute aerosol as the primary reason, then you would in the open ocean, farther off the coast, there might be a better condition for the aerosol argument, right? So low aerosol. So aerosol plays a role modulating them. If there's no aerosol, they might look slightly different, but the fundamental reason for the existence of this prevalence constituted there are sinking motion and cold ocean current. That's kind of are limiting the clouds and kept them, boxed them there. The cartoon I'm showing here is a classic cartoon, shows that the rising branch and the sinking branch of the Hadley cell, that the sinking branch will have some clouds, but those clouds will be kept by the sinking air. There's inversion. And actually there are two, it's more than just this. There are two sinking motion. We just talked about the Hadley circulation going north and south, centered along the equator, but just from east-west, there's another circulation. You might have learned this from other classes called Walker's circulation, which it's a cell, east-west cell. So air rises over Indonesia, warmest air, sinks in the eastern part of the Pacific. And then air rises over Africa, rises over Amazon, and sinks in between, right? So this, you can connect to the distribution of deep convective clouds. There are local maximum here, here, here. So it rises. There was sinking both north and south and east-west that generates this sinking motion. Then if you put together the sinking motion of both Hadley and Walker's circulation, then in the subtropical part of the eastern part of the ocean would be the combined sinking effect. So both from Hadley and Walker's circulation. So that makes the sinking motion very strong in those areas. Cold water also contributes to that because the cold air, contributes to the sense that the cloud will not grow. They lack the fuel energy to grow. They will form, but they will not grow. Then sinking motion caps the clouds further. So to make those clouds, well, low, concentrated in the boundary layer. These two cloud types are the most two important cloud types from a climate perspective. The stratiform clouds, stratocumulus clouds, are the cloud type that cools the planet because they reflect so much sunlight. They do not trap much infrared radiation because that's close to the surface. Whereas the deep convection both reflects sunlight and traps infrared radiation and generates rainfall. So these two cloud types play most important role in modulating energy, modulating water cycle in the climate system. So that's oftentimes we single them out for separate studies. So in this class, I'm using them to make the case that by looking at this cloud distribution, you can infer what's happening in the atmosphere circulation. Source of water, it's over ocean, that there are plenty of water. Yeah, there. As I say, it's cold, but it's not as cold as Arctic. So there still something like 15 degrees C. The water still evaporates. Yeah, still a lot of evaporation. Other places?
Yeah, why?
Okay, very good point. Once you're, let's go back to this figure. Once you move away from the coast into the open ocean, you will see clouds not in the form of stratus, but more in the form of cumulus clouds. Like if you move towards Hawaii, the difference between them is that these clouds are optically thinner. So actually the figure I showed earlier, this figure, when you are close to the coast, the clouds are like a thin layer that's unbroken. As you move away, clouds are more like the broken cells like this. They're thinner. So the capping motion is not as strong. So there are sometimes bubbles coming up, and then some of the bubbles, if they come up higher, they will not develop into deep convection, but taller than near the coast. As they go up, they generate nearby sinking motion as well. So you can see the cell, like what you see in the boiling water, rising motion, sinking motion, kind of layout in here, open cell. So those clouds are generally thinner because they're not a layer of clouds sitting there being kept. They are more dynamic and active. So they show up as cumulus clouds in here. See, open ocean, you see a lot of cumulus clouds, fair weather cumulus clouds. Those, if you think about a typical picture of Hawaii Island, right? You see a few pieces of clouds. So those are the clouds you're seeing here, cumulus clouds. There are still low clouds. Generally, there is sinking motion. These clouds will not grow very tall. That's why you go to Hawaii. I mean, if it's a thunderstorm every day, you don't go there. It must be a good weather most of the time. So yeah, that's because it's capped by sinking motion generally. And then the clouds are not as thick as off the coast. They are thinner cumulus clouds. Okay. Other remaining questions on these two cloud types we've discussed? Most important types for climate studies, yeah.
So the deep convection clouds absorb radiation and
so they both interfere with radiation. The stratocumulus clouds primarily reflect sunlight, but they do not trap much infrared radiation because their top is so low. Their temperature is about this. It's very similar to the surface. For deep convection, they also reflect sunlight, but also trap infrared radiation. So they do both, interact with both. And deep convection also generates a lot of rain. And there's a third reason for deep convection, which I'll come to in a second. Before that, any questions?
Yeah, so, yeah, those couple of guys about the whole circulation and current people contribute to the maximum people. I guess most of the maximum also just less confidence. So I guess is the
yeah, I think you asked the question that last time we interacted, right? So the role of land mass.
I know, for example,
yeah,
like what's the big Americas, they kind of have the right that kind of tracks the moisture question. But I guess
I think it does. The other day I sent you a paper. It talks about the seasonal cycle of these clouds.
right.
These clouds off the coast of California, they reach their maximum in local summertime. Wintertime is less. So local summertime is the time when ocean has high pressure and land is low pressure. Because land is warmer in summertime, ocean is cooler relatively. So the air rises over land and sinks over nearby ocean. So that may add to the subsidence and the sinking pressure of the air. Wintertime is the opposite. Wintertime, ocean is warmer, land is colder. So tend to be a rising motion over ocean. It will break this cap. So will partially dissipate these clouds just based on that land-ocean contrast alone. There are multiple factors working, but if you only think about land-ocean contrast, wintertime, land-ocean contrast destroy these clouds. Summertime encourages these clouds. So, yep. So it does play a role, I think. So these are a lot of deep questions you can investigate. So if you are thinking about investigating winter and summer of these clouds as your final project, the data set I gave you, right, it's monthly. You could group them by winter, group summer of many years and contrast them, see how they differ. And then perhaps find the pressure for winter and pressure for summer and see if what I explained does indeed bear out in the data. The pressure varies that way. Yep. Very good. Those are very healthy discussion. I mean, this class is meant to be that way. I give you some food for thoughts. You can grow. Okay, I guess what's this? Yeah, to better appreciate the vertical motion, the making of clouds, you can look at the cloud set vertical cross section. So these are no longer clouds in top-down view, but in cross-sectional view, you can see that x-axis is the latitude, y-axis is height. You can see that along the equator, clouds are deeper. So I kind of visually show you the rising motion. And subtropics, you can see clouds are shallower, are capped near the boundary layer. So there's visually the sinking motion. Then mid-latitude, you see again, another layer of rising. So that gives you visually already cells, right? Tropical Hadley cell, Farrell cell. So you can connect these arrows to make cells. So that's how the circulation works. That's kind of a nice way of viewing them. Okay, so a third point I want to make is that if you look at the top three rows, at the top row, the three columns, three cells in the top row, they are from left to the right, right? Cirrus, cirrostratus, and deep convection. So you will see that they are actually very similar. The most similar ones are cirrostratus and deep convection. So if you compare these two maps, they differ by amounts, but in terms of pattern, it's very similar. Then cirrus clouds are more abundant, but for the tropics, the location are once again similar, right? So the reason for this actually is because if you think about clouds, a thunderstorm, here I'm showing one against the sunset. So and then put this in the context of the cloud classification retrieval. Deep convection is the trunk part. The thickest part is where optical thickness is the highest. So that's classified as deep convection. And then the part that extends out, that's still very thick, is what we call envelope clouds, will be classified as cirrostratus, right? So then the thinnest part, that's the outmost part, will last longer after the storm dissipates, will be classified as cirrus clouds. So in this sense, they go together, right? So if the cloud convective storm are just like this, you would probably see them just go side by side, the pattern everywhere. That's almost the case for the tropics, deep convection, cirrostratus, and cirrus that go together. And mid-latitude, there might be some differences because mid-latitude cirrus, oftentimes you see this curly shaped cirrus that generate in situ by itself. So that may have nothing to do with convection. So that's why sometimes there are some maximum mid-latitude that are not overlapping the tracks of deep convection and cirrostratus. So there are some places where they're so similar. Other places are not as similar. But deep convection and cirrostratus are almost always similar. They go together. This topic we're going to revisit because this exposes the arbitrary nature of classifying clouds, right? So you can chop them just by your arbitrary boundary. In reality, if you know that deep convection always goes with cirrostratus in certain places, certain climate regime, you could classify them together. So that's a new concept we're going to learn next week. It's called cloud regime. So we're going to analyze that. Well, actually, Gabby, you are analyzing that in your other project, right? It's the environmental project. But background for that is that people, when they look at this, they feel like, well, just arbitrarily chopping the same entity of clouds into different types may not be the most scientific way of doing it. So they want to group them together. If they go together, if these clouds always come together, just group them together, call them a cloud regime. Okay, so I'm using EAS417 as an example to introduce these different cloud types. But when you play with the data, just keep in mind that the same file I gave you contain other information. For example, the snow ice cover in some of the variables, or even elevation. Perhaps there's SST. I'm not sure if it's inside this file, but snow ice cover is there. I found it. So if you want to investigate that topic, it could be pulled out from the EAS417 dataset I gave you. Right? You want to study how snow and ice changes monthly. The dataset can provide that information. It's saved there because they need this information to retrieve clouds. They want to know the surface type. So they bring in from other sources the snow ice cover. Just bring this to your attention. Now, coming to the homework, I think you really should start it now. The homework, the first 3 questions are basically plotting these cloud types, right? Using the data I gave you, just plot them and describe a few features you see. I think the 3rd question asks you to compare clouds with precipitation. I haven't touched upon precipitation per se, but precipitation, we know that it must come from clouds. But what cloud type is best correlated with precipitation? That's something I want you to study a little bit by plotting them. And then I think the 4th and 5th question ask you to slice the data to get a specific month and see how precipitation changes, right? So that's meant to leverage on the 3D nature. What I meant by 3D is latitude, longitude versus time. So the 3D nature of the data set. So you can also look at the temporal variation. In addition to the long-term average, you can also see how that varies from time to time. Certain month, well, the problem here, you will have to study it for yourself. You will see that precipitation pattern changes from 1 January to next January. Right? So they're both January, they're both winter time. They're supposed to be similar, but there are some differences. So you are asked to explain that difference. So work on it. It's due in 2 days. And I think another important purpose of the homework is for you to really think about the final project, because I want you to use these examples to build upon these examples to come up with your own question, what you want to investigate to build a final project. So that's something I will talk about now. Here's the breakdown of the grade, right? You will see that you've been very nervous preparing for the test. We have 3 of the tests, but all 3 put together is only 30% of the credit. But the final project alone will account for 30% of undergraduate and 40% for graduate students. So that part should be an emphasis of this class. So it's about time to start thinking about what topic you want to work on. Right, so let's take a look at what the requirements are. Here's the rubrics for the final project. I want you to define a science question or a specific subject. So this is something Gabe asked me the other day. So because originally my requirement rubrics is that define a science question that can be studied. So Gabe asked me, does it have to be a science question, or could it be just to looking at the phenomena like convection, certain other features, instead of framing this as a science question? So I was thinking about this because there are some debates. You might have learned this concept in high school, that how scientists conduct scientific analysis, the scientific method. They start from defining a question, right? They're forming a hypothesis, what they call the working hypothesis. And then they design an experiment. They collect data and they analyze data and draw a conclusion to either prove the hypothesis or disprove it. So it's a falsifiable hypothesis that you form in the beginning. So that's kind of the method and the typical scientific methods. But recent years, there are debates. People think that, this hypothesis driven, sometimes it's too limiting because sometimes we don't even know the problem well enough to form a hypothesis. So people propose the data driven, meaning that you go analyze the data and let the data speak for itself and find something that's inside the data that that will have some interesting scientific implication. So I think I can accept that as well. So that's why I modify this requirement a little bit by asking you to define a science question or a specific subject, what you think is valid, that can be studied using satellite data. So the only thing I want you to avoid is to do a fishing expedition. So what I meant by that is that sometimes people may think, well, this data set is a gold mine. I will throw some analysis to it. And whatever comes out, I'll catch and present. But that kind of approach is not very effective, I think. Because what if you don't catch anything at all? By the end of the semester, what do you present, right? So at least you need to have a target, a specific subject. So if you want to study deep convection, storm, if you want to study stratocumulus clouds off the coast of California, if you want to study cirrostratus related to deep convection. So just identify that. It's just if you don't have a working hypothesis, a science question, that's fine. You want to use the data set to study the seasonal cycle, year-to-year variation of these specific cloud types in relation to precipitation, something like that will be fine. So just you have to be clear what you want to study. That is your first thing to think about. So for the rest of them, you will work on for the remaining of the semester. But at least for now, in the next week or two, I think I really urge you to form a team, either find another team member or by yourself, and identify a question or a subject that you want to study using satellite data. Right. So once you have that, we're going to go over if you have the data set that can help you answer the question or address the subject, then what kind of analysis do you want to conduct? So the rest of them we're going to discuss. But for now, I think you need to identify a subject and form your team. So hopefully, let me go back to the beginning. I think we have 2 weeks before the spring break. I hope you can form you can define a subject before the spring break so that you can do some preliminary analysis during the break so that we can continue to discuss it after the break, because we don't have too much time. If you look at the scheduling here, if you form your question subject before the spring break, you will have 2 weeks after the spring break to work on them, right? So not a whole lot of time. So find a question that is doable in a few weeks. It doesn't have to be a thesis type question, a small question, a small subject that can be addressed by satellite data. And also, I'm going to introduce you more satellite data. So far, I've introduced to you ISCCP and GPCP, trim a little bit. And in next class, not next class, next lab, Wednesday's lab. So Wednesday is going to be online on Zoom again, because it's lab. I'm going to introduce you 2 more data sets, 1, 2, 3, 3 more data sets. Well, it should be 2 more because trim I've already introduced. So here's one example. On top, upper left is the MODIS view of convective clouds in terms of the brightness temperature for MODIS. The bottom is the trim 3-hourly precipitation rates. So you can see these rain cells are embedded in this deep convective clouds. These clouds are so widespread, but not everywhere is raining. Only a few tiny spots, those rainy cells embedded in these clouds are producing rain. Right? And there's a line here. This line is where cloud set crosses and give you the vertical cross section of this storm. So on the right-hand side is the vertical cross section of clouds along this line. So you can see there's a deep convective storm here, tower, deep convection, and cirrus that's coming out of it. The top one is the reflectivity from cloud set. The bottom one is their classification of cloud types, deep convection, nimbus, stratus, cumulus, etc., based on the vertical shape of these clouds. Right. So on Wednesday, I'm going to introduce you these 3 more data sets, so that if you want to do case study, if you don't want to study long-term climatology, you could utilize this data set and the tools I'm going to introduce to you to study this cloud systems in more details. Because the data set I introduced to you so far, those monthly average, you cannot see these individual storms. They are they're being all thrown into the average, the monthly mean. So if you want to study specific cases, this data set will be more helpful. Okay, so we have 5 minutes left, but I don't want to continue to lecture. I'll take questions. Any questions about the final project? About the upcoming labs, homework? You mean the homework? Okay, so I'm fine with giving you 2 more days, but you should really start now. Don't wait until. So for the students online, I extend the homework deadline by 2 more days, because I know some students here will travel on a NOAA event. So to be fair for everyone, I extend that for 2 more days, Friday. Just, but don't wait until Friday to work on it. Do it now. There are questions, can email me or discuss with me on Wednesday. Yeah. Yeah. It's all the other procedures is the same. So on the homework, the first line is the instruction. There's the deadline. There's the file name convention. So put your file name in such a way that you can better group your files. Okay, so if you have questions, if you want to discuss with me on your final project, send me email. Let's schedule a time, okay? Esther, please send me email to find a time.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so if there's no more question, class is finished here. See you Wednesday online.
When they're working on their kind of project. For example, clouds.
Hold on, let me close this. Pause